quality of life systems killed the MMORPG. I think was sort of like the base thesis of your various posts. And I feel like I couldn't tell. I feel like you're using some pretty direct and I don't want to, I think sensational is too sensational of a word, but everything is now quality of life and the game autoplays like every single modern phone MMO, things like that. So it's kind of like it's picking an extreme and going with it, right? I would say my response, I tried to cover a number of the points that you made. Now, just on autoplay specifically, like you say autoplay like it's like it was an evolution. It's like quality of life got so crazy that we eventually just said, screw it, we're not even going to play the game anymore in autoplay. Basically, to your conversation that you are having in here, you're talking about quality of life. I don't think quality of life in MMOs is inherently bad. And my argument in response to what you said was basically that quality of life clearly did not kill MMOs because there are more people playing MMOs today than there ever had people playing MMOs. And if that affected player socializing, but to what degree? I would argue too that I haven't seen a metric that shows me that that's the case. So we actually worked with the university in Hamburg at Big Point, a company that I was at 2015 through 2017. One of the things that I've been curious about for quite a while, and I hadn't seen a metric on it, was basically a lot of what drives us on the business side of things is we're looking at the lifetime value of a customer, right? And with a subscription-based game, if you don't have any other input, if you don't have any other means of getting money from players, you kind of know, hey, if we're charging $10 per player, we have 10 players, cool, we've got $100 a month, blah, 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 that extrapolates out until all the other things in terms of like, what's our take of that, blah, 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 how do we cover operating expenses? But when we're getting that $10 from a player, then the thing we're curious about is like, how long do we retain them? So if we retain them for 10 months, now we've got, a lifetime value of $100 per player. In the free-to-play games where you can basically have that be $1 million or whatever, then that's fine, because then you look at essentially metrics like average revenue per user or sort of, return on ad spend and all these other metrics that you're looking to basically see is the money that I'm spending to acquire users returning the right profit for us. I was always curious about the social value of a given player, right? Especially in something like a PvP game, which at the time I was working on a game that you've never heard of called Dark Orbit, which actually had like 400,000 or 500,000 monthly active users and was making pretty decent money, like $1.5 million to $2.5 million a month. As a free-to-play, pretty much pay to win for most of its lifetime game that we were trying to kind of rehab and extend the lifespan a bit, but it was definitely on its long tail. So anyway, one of the things working in MMOs I was curious about, and we worked with the university to try to figure this problem out, and they did a lot of like data analysis and tried to figure it out, but didn't come up with a really good solution for us. But I'm still curious about it, is like the social value of a player. And what that would be is there a way to look at how social a player is and then apply the social metrics to the sort of the financial metrics, right? Are there players who have clusters of players around them who then also are higher LTV players? Are those players who are the more social players, what is their actual value? Because in a free-to-play game, it's very possible that you have players that are social, but they don't spend much, right? Because it could be you have one of those people that is like the leader, but then people feed into that and they take care of them. Or on the flip side, like my guild leader when I was in EQ, in the Dark Exile, he would make sure that like our clerics would have better video cards or whatever, right? Like shit like that. And so, because he had his own cash. But then again, you could also see that he also had a pretty high social value. And then if you look at the various officers in the guild, they probably also had pretty good networks and connections. And you could see like retention rates as applied to, that'd be another thing, like looking at retention metrics as applied to these nodes of sort of high value or high social value players. And so this was something like we had a couple university students that I guess were like trying to use that to maybe do their master's thesis or whatever on. And so by the time I left, like they still hadn't really figured it out. And, we got some interesting data from them and stuff. But it's something where I would say we talk about games being less social, but I think other people have done a really fantastic job of maybe attacking the modern MMOs aren't as social angle, like Josh Hayes and others, in sort of asking or posing the question of, All right, but how many of those people are then they find certain communities or Discord or whatever through playing the game? So even if they're not as social in game, does it really mean that those games are less social? And then we're also talking about relative numbers, right? The idea is if you've got one game that's got really great social features in it, and people are very social in game, right? Like that's one of our tenets. It's something we're very focused on, is like increasing the social friction and providing mechanisms that sort of benefit you for being more social, and we're a party focused game, etc. But say we only have a customer base of let's be wild and just go off into fantasy space and say we have 1 million subscribers. Oh my god, we've exceeded all expectations, right, for a niche game. But then when you do the math and look at in a less social game that maybe has 50 million people playing it, I mean, hell, how do we catch up to like Roblox with whatever it is, 200 million monthly active users, 250 million monthly active users, or Minecraft, right? Where it may not be the same social dynamics, it may not be the same feel when you talk about social in terms of the server level sort of social interaction that you have, but it's still on the whole more social activity. Anyway, so that's one thought on that. I don't buy the premise that quality of life killed MMOs, because I don't feel like MMOs have died. I feel like they've only grown. And I think our definition of like MMO, when Xbox Live first came out, I looked at it and was like, hey guys, keep in mind that's essentially in effect an MMO, in that you're going to have a shitload of people going in there. They're going to be spending their time in there. They're going to form communities in there. There's going to be shared value through progression systems in there, etc. My grandmother playing on Club Pogo, like when she was trying to figure out what the hell I did for a living when I talked about MMOs, I looked into Club Pogo and I was like, basically it's like what you do right now. You hang out with your friends and you play different games together, and you earn points that you can spend on virtual greeting cards and stuff like that. So Autolysius, tipping would be rad. Maybe do something like Twitch where you can gift subs. Would be fun to randomly gift subs. Yeah, that would be cool as well. I think the idea of being able to buy people subs and stuff will be something we'd have to look at and see how Sola supports that and things like that. And then tipping would probably just be through, standard sort of service where they get a cut. So we've looked at like Gumroad and other stuff. So Midgard said, I really like place, party, and peril designs, especially when it's a consistent party and you can see a progression in the narrative. So we're probably going to mix the party up a bit though. But I wouldn't be shocked if we see some consistent faces in there. Nicodemus said 3Ps is a great design concept. Maybe at some point Goblin will do like an iconic group to use in multiple art pieces. So reinforcing that. Yeah. It's possible. When it first came up, we actually arrived at the 3Ps, I think, by way of discussing should there be iconic characters. I could have sworn that was an earlier part of the conversation. It's like, should we have like our Furionas and stuff? And my pushback on that was, let's first focus on the vibe and less on the characters, because we're not really about making a character driven game in the sense that we're not heavily story driven where you're really like fixating on specific in-game characters and their progression, and you're not sitting here going, what's going on with Sylvanas today or whatever. We're talking about out of game payments and payment approaches. Yeah, we were just talking about different business models and stuff. Lightning said, I've played hundreds of MMOs as they've come and gone over time. The ones that seem to shut down the fastest are the ones without much social interaction required, as well as the on-rail worlds like WoW instead of the open worlds like EQ. Yeah, that's probably partially because of social stickiness or retention based on the social aspect of it. But it's also probably any number of other factors, right? Like if you were to look at something like WildStar, was it strictly the social aspect of it, or was it sort of the issues with the difficulty of the in-game and sort of the stratification of the player base and their like what they were providing? And then if you make a game that's very like on rails and very high fidelity content, something like Star Wars The Old Republic or whatever, how quickly can you make that content? How big of a team do you need to support it? A lot of like whether or not a game stays up or down has very little to do with those factors and more with like unromantic factors of like, is there something going on elsewhere in the company? Like 30-40% of the DC Universe Online team got laid off right after we shipped because the overall portfolio wasn't performing, and DCO didn't come out as like ultra mega success, right? And so then when that team's cut, what is that? How does that impact the game's ability to deliver content, blah, 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 right? So I've seen cancellations that were based on really the company's overall sort of portfolio more than it was any one game. Then you've got the, how quickly can you produce the content? Like, there's all sorts of factors that go into it. You know what I mean? So I would say that I'm not disagreeing with you, but I also think that to just have it be, it's because it wasn't social enough. It's probably missing all sorts of other trees in that forest. There was a comment earlier about maybe it was John or somebody that was like, that made the comment about how did some of the quality of life features, like the quality of life features came from somewhere. And I would say, again, for those of you that are just tuning in, everything that I'm saying is based off of my understanding of sort of either what happened with the evolution of EQ while I was there, or what is potentially happening at other companies, but I'm only speculating. And again, I think other content creators out there have done really solid analyses. I don't know that it's always correct or I always agree with them, but you know, there's some great analysis out there about what's happened with specific games. And I would say for EQ in particular, I was a part of several of the more controversial changes that happened, especially during Pop in the Eldon era. Probably, I would even give myself credit for championing some of the more controversial changes, and I'm more than happy to take the shit for the resulting impact on the game. I can explain what we were thinking at the time and why. So I responded with some of that in Discord, and I think I've mentioned some of this before, but like several of the things that we did, things that I championed are things that I wrote about here. So Plane of Knowledge books and the Plane of Knowledge was actually based, as I mentioned in my response to you, Plane of Knowledge was based on the idea that we were seeing people come into EverQuest. And at the time, I forget how many servers we had, and we could not just collapse the servers. And we would, and I think we had like recommended servers at the time. Like if you're a new player, try this server first. But I don't know how much impact that's had, and I've worked on other MMOs since then where we tried to actively funnel new players into servers that had different levels of player counts in order to sort of keep them balanced. So like automated balancing of the server base, and it's a difficult problem. And so the problem that we had was that we had new players coming into EQ during that period, and despite the fact that we were sort of peaking on subscriber base, the old world was so abandoned by that point, because I'd say pre-Eldon, there was nothing really going on in the old world. And so what we found was people were coming in to, there was a combination of essentially, if you looked at how many starting cities were there? 10, 12, 14? I guess if you're including Charval. Let's assume that, let's like round down and say that it was 10 starting cities. If there's 10 starting cities across, let's just be generous and say for whatever reason they never looked past the first 5 servers, then you've got 50 potential starting points for a new player, and depending on how many new players were coming in each day, they may land in any one of those. And we weren't seeing like a massive influx of new players at that point. You know what I mean? It's like, it was a fairly small amount of new players continuing to come in, but it was steady. So they would come in and they may see one other player, or they may see 2 or 3 other players at the most, maybe. And they would come in because they heard about this massively multiplayer online social experience. And they came in and said, you know, like, oh shit, I don't see any other players. What's the hype about? Right? And so the points that you're making now are the hindsight that we have. And it's one of those things that I've commented on before. And so like Zoidberg said, I think the old world became abandoned because content wasn't updated in the old world. Looking back, it should have got the Fortnite treatment, right? The problem is we had a team that through sort of our business directives was focused on making new content and selling new boxes of content. Like we had to put a box on a shelf. Right. And it's fine when people are like, oh, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with it either. And I'm pretty sure the team didn't agree with it. Right. So I was the expansion lead, and the bulk of the design team worked with me on expansions. We had like 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 if we were shifting people back and forth, people focusing on the live game. And for the most part, the people focusing on the live game were fixing bugs. And then there were people that had a foot in both sides, right? And so it was like something like the itemization guy or the spell person or whatever, right? So most of their effort was focused on making expansions, which, you know, when the team was doing 2 expansions a year, and you look at other MMO companies with much bigger teams cranking out like 1 expansion every year or 1 expansion every year and a half or 2 years. So yeah, the thought at the time was, if we checked the data and before we made this decision, we looked at data, right? And there were people that were not, basically these zones would go without people going through them for days or weeks or months. And so the old world was pretty much abandoned. And so this idea of like, well, when the Plane of Knowledge books could lead you from city to city, you no longer needed druids or wizards, and it killed the social friction in the old world. Maybe you've got firsthand experience where you were a druid and or a wizard, and it ruined your social experience at that point. I think I'd be very curious to know that really did happen. Like maybe you're remembering it wrong, because at the time we didn't see anything resembling that sort of behavior back then. The old world was dead. And for the most part, you wouldn't see people there. So I don't buy it. And so the idea of like people having the opportunity, the 3 people that do start playing with each other. So the dwarf and, the guy who started in Kanos who want to play together. The idea was, let's give them a very, efficient route of joining up together, seeing other people pretty quickly, getting to where they want to go, and then having their experience. Do I think it was the best approach, or could we have mitigated the need for that by being able to focus strictly on redoing the old world, and having a live team that basically just focused on maintaining the value of the subscription without, the little bit of money that we got from boxes? And keep in mind, the reason for a lot of companies that push expansions isn't just for the box sales. It's also that PR moment. But you can do that the way, like you said, Fortnite, right? So you could have bigger events and say we're updating the world and get the same sort of PR effect. More so these days, because I think the media is more willing to do it. But you've also got to realize back then, games journalists wanted to know, what's your expansion? They weren't looking to know what was your live update as much. So we just live in different times. What do I feel like Pop's reception would have been without Plane of Knowledge in the books? At the time, there was a lot less bitching than in hindsight, if I remember correctly. I don't know. Maybe you can like Internet Archive and show me all of the various furious posts about the game being broken because of the books. But people were way more pissed off at us about flagging than they were the books, if I remember correctly. And also, just because you can find an angry post about whatever doesn't necessarily mean that the bulk of the players actually felt that way, because there's literally an angry post about everything. So let's see. Other thing that I championed that pissed people off, it was instance dungeons. Instance dungeons was a big one that I championed that was controversial. POC became the hub for people to pimp themselves out for cybering. I didn't realize that. That is a bonus. People need love, man. So yeah, the whole reason for POC was to increase social friction. I think that's honestly one of the first times I started flailing my arms about social friction in those actual words. That's an interesting point. Pazzy160 said, as someone who really first played EQ 2 or 3 years ago, the POC books were the core of my co-op experience. My friend and I would explore using the books and then go get to the other saying, I went through this book and saw a nice dungeon. Let's go inside together later tonight. So yeah, maybe an easier way to go explore when the mechanisms that used to exist to help you in exploration. And honestly, it took you from city to city, right? For the most part, you still had to go out through the rest of the world. So I don't know. The instance dungeons, I think I wrote a pretty lengthy response here about it. So I'm just going to read it because it'll be more concise. And again, keep in mind, like our primary thing was just trying to make it more social, and we feel like it worked. And it was absolutely unfortunate that we didn't have a team for maintaining old world content. Keep in mind, I worked on the Chardock revamp with Rich Waters. The two of us did that in 2 days. I worked on what was I think we did Kazakh Thule. Was there a Plane of Fear revamp? I remember working on like 3 zone revamps. And Kazakh Thule is like, yeah, we made some things worse or whatever, but we also had 24 hours to knock that out. Did I have a hand in any Fable mobs? No, that was after my time there. POC may have been better in retrospect if it only accessed mostly select old world zones. Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure there are other ways to maybe improve how that worked, or improve the intent there, like provide a better solution. But I think the main thing that stands out is like, how do we want to do that in M&M? Well, we want to focus on maintaining the value of the old world. Like when people ask, why is Night Harbor so big? Well, because we want to look at it and see, can we make this also interesting adventure environment as well? Is there a way for us to build the game with live updates in mind, and focus on having a nice enough concentration of content around the various cities, enough changes over time to the content in those cities, build our tools in a way that allows for easy scheduling of content and changes of content, and have reveals where it's like, oh shit, there's an entire different set of catacombs under the city that we didn't know about before. All of that stuff that sort of keeps you coming back to the city. Simple systems in terms of like how merchants work and where you can actually use a merchant versus not. And we just added something, I'll show you in a minute. We just added something over the holiday where we can define what merchants will or won't buy from you, right? So we have more control over like getting you to come back in and need to go to specific places, or need to come back to places like cities, etc. So, we're gonna make an attempt at trying to mitigate the problem before it becomes a problem by really focusing on retaining the value of cities. Somebody in chat pointed out, like, instead of saying starting cities, we should say cities. It's not just a place you start and then leave, right? Never to come back to. A shifty gnome here. He doesn't want my snake fang. He doesn't want my bone chips anymore, right? But I do believe I've set him up, so if I summon item Batwing, but he'll buy that Batwing. So lots of little things sort of factoring into how we try to make specific elements of the world retain their value is where we're going to be playing around to see if we can improve on, on basically the old content model that sort of created these problems in the first place. Thanks, Pansy. Did horses come into EQ at like Luckland? I feel like that should have been more of a priority with people being upset about travel across Karanas and stuff. Yeah, it came in at Luckland. I think a world needs to be built with mounts in mind. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we don't have our mounts in yet. We've got a good design for mounts. We've got Ali who's chomping at the bit to do mounts, but we've been pushing that for some of the other stuff. But before we go much further into world development, we want to get mounts in so that we've got a very good understanding of sort of their impact in the world. Why did we have such limited time to work on revamps? Because they just weren't considered like work. We'd get the directive from above that we needed to provide something very interesting very quickly. There'd be a question of like, hey, could you guys revamp a zone over this weekend? And we would. I think the Kazakh Thule revamp, if I'm not mistaken, was even done during Valentine's, because I could have sworn my girlfriend at the time, or fiance at the time, wound up, our Valentine dinner was like me, Steve, Bill Fisher, probably her. She did not have a great evening. Are mounts just faster in all cases, or will there be mounts a player gets that are more utility based other than just run speed? Absolutely on the utility. That's why we've kind of put out there, not to necessarily fully distinguish, but as we're working on the system, we're doing pack animals. So just the idea of being able to carry more, but then they come at their own costs, right? Because they'll use food and drink as well. So there's maintenance costs with them. They have to be able to carry their own fuel in a sense, right? But they will be able to help you move more shit around. And one of the reasons why we've gone with like the more constrained, we've got 1 backpack, 3 bags, 3 belt pouches, and then your 8 sort of pocket slots. That constraints then makes it so that pack animals and mounts have more value, but then they also come at a cost. Trade caravans is something that we want to be sort of a natural extension of this lightning. Will they die? Yeah. So the idea is that mounts can die. They leave a corpse. The corpse stays there. In theory, there was a really cool piece of art from the community. Sorry that I don't remember exactly who did it. That someone drew that was a necromancer on a wagon that... The intent was like basically the necromancer would go reanimate your mount, make it an undead mount that would stay alive for a certain amount of time, like just from a conversation we had in chat, kind of goofing around. But it wound up being a really fun drawing. What's the vision for mounts? Flying exotic mounts or keep them more plain? We're gonna go deep on plain but fun, and then inevitably we'll have stuff that feels a little bit more exotic. I think any flying that's done. We've been back and forth on this one, and we're going to have to lock that down sooner rather than later with regards to the zone design and how we want to do it. But like if you see whenever it's like, you know, if I go into bat form, then and fly around, it's a lot of fun to fly, but you know, I think it's going to really have to be constrained. I could picture flying mounts working about like bats, to be honest. They're just animated a bit above the ground or something. For that very reason, Droop, like we want to be careful even with something like Lev, let alone a flying mount. So Gnome Tinker Wagon, very possible. Run speeds tend to proliferate quickly too, so keeping it low and more utility seems like a good feel. I remember there being 300% speed mounts and WoW before the simplification. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we're going to be doing with our time as we play test and just keep working on like the bulk of the content for the game is, and I'll speak for me, but I do feel like this is something that I'm going to be constantly like asking the team and sort of working with Nick on or whatever, is like, I'd really like to take all of that cool stuff like levitation or run speed, or you know, some of the utility that once you get it, it's like a binary switch in older games where it's like, you know, if you've got levitate or DMF or whatever, it's just boom, it's so super powered. I'd love to basically take that and stretch it over an entire spell line or multiple spell lines that very much feel progressive. You know, your levitate, rather than just being a, you know, 2-minute levitate or whatever from the onset, is something, it's like, it's more of a oh shit utility where it's, hey, I can cast it on and it works as more like a feather fall for 10 seconds or 20 seconds and then boom. Okay, so that allowed me to fall safely, but I didn't go horizontally, you know, for a ton of distance, right? And then levels later, you get something that lasts a little bit longer and maybe has a little less of a decay on like keeping you up, that kind of thing, right? A little temporary floating disc mount that you can use if you're with a mage or some shit like that. So, or take it to an extreme, the torpor spell lines for shamans where it starts off with pretty significant negatives, still worth it. Right, so as long as we've got some balance in there, that's the goal from, you know, from my end is mainly how do we take something that's cool like that and just stretch it out for a bit more. Whether it be through some potential balancing negative or detrimental effect, or tactical consideration. It's like, oh, you've got this thing, but if you get hit, then it you know, fades instantly or whatever it is, right? Like maybe a bad example, but just sort of do more of that stuff that allows you to, allows us to stretch out the content and the progression and the field progression and your ability to sort of navigate the environments and mitigate obstacles. I'm hired. I'm the right man for this job. Yes, I've made it. Thank you, Archmage. No, but we've got a crew that's background is EQ and in some folks' case more maybe classic WoW or whatever, but gets what our intent here. It's really nice working with the team because, I mean, folks get it, and we recognize the things that we liked about EQ in the other sort of early era of MMOs, and we're looking at how best to sort of take that forward without going the same path that other games sort of took it down, right? So, you know, this is kind of with regards to quality of life and things of that. So it might be neat for some levitate abilities to keep you out of the water, for example, but that's it. Water walking. I mean, in theory, we know what the water volume is. So really quirky shit like that is definitely something that I'm hoping we get more in.